voltage. It's set negative 70 millivolts. Well, now we want to talk about what happens when we want to send a signal. Now, the signal is properly called the action potential. This is also known as a nerve impulse. You're sending that signal down. Now, the way it sends the signal, you've got neuron number 1. It's going to receive a stimulus, and then that stimulus is perceived by the dendrites, who are then going to send it to the cell body. The signal goes down the axon and then hits a synapse. Here's our neuron number 2, sending that signal to the action potentials. Down the axon, getting to the axon terminals. Now, I mentioned the Lego, stepping on a Lego. Well, imagine this is your pain sensors going down the neuron up your leg. Now, before we move on, we need to talk about a new type of channel, and these are really interesting. These are called voltage-gated ion channels. Now, because they are gated, that means they can exist as a open and shut position. So if they are open, they look like a lot of the other channels we've talked about. But they have a little piece that is pushed away from the opening. Now, if they're shut, if they're closed, then what will happen is that little piece will now close on the channel, and nothing can get through. What dictates whether or not it's open or closed is what voltage it is. So that's going to be a key, because if it hits a certain voltage, those ion channels open up. Normally they're closed. So if we were to just scooch back for a second, this picture we talked about the sodium-potassium pump, the leak channels for potassium, the leak channels for sodium, but we didn't have the full picture. Now we're going to see voltage-gated ion channels. Now, in an action potential, you have 2 events. And one of the best analogies that I have found over the years is that of a stadium wave. So you go to a game and the audience is sitting inside the little stadium, and suddenly they decide to do the wave, and it starts here. So imagine this is a message and we want to send this message. Well, as the stadium wave ripples across the audience, imagine at the end of that stadium wave, these people now have the message. And that's what's happening to your neurons. You're going to start at one end of the axon. You're going to then send the signal all the way down to the axon terminals. And just like a stadium wave, there are 2 main events. In a stadium wave, you stand up and cheer, and then the next moment you are sitting back down in your chair. So there are 2 events. One is called depolarization. And in depolarization, the sodium channels, these are voltage gated, the sodium channels open, and then here's where you just have to remember that in our previous picture there were more sodium on the outside. Well, good old diffusion, if you open up those channels, sodium is going to diffuse rapidly inside. And then the inside becomes more positive now. And just ponder that mathematically, you're adding more positive charges. That means the inside becomes more positive. Now, this is a positive feedback system. That's not because this was a positive charge. If you go back to what negative feedback means you're trying to get it back to a balanced system. But this is a positive feedback. The more sodium channels open, the more positive it becomes. That leads to more channels opening. And so this is kind of like that vicious cycle where everything just kind of keeps going and going. So this is a good example of a positive feedback. We don't see many of those in animal systems. We see a lot of negative feedback, but not too many positive feedback. So that's depolarization. Now, I came up many years ago, I came up with a really stupid word or acronym to help you remember it. Depolarization means that sodium is coming in. denane. I know it's silly, but by golly, it works. So depolarization, sodium ions are diffusing in. Repolarization, and this is the annoying part, there's only one letter that's different. Repolarization is when potassium channels, these are voltage gated, they open. And remember, there's more potassium on the inside. So good old diffusion, if they open, that means potassium is going to diffuse outside the cell. And my silly little mnemonic is repolarization, potassium, K, goes out, RECO. And that's going to help you. Just in the pinch, you'll be able to piece them back together very easily. And in the meantime, this also means that now the sodium channels shut when repolarization is occurring. And again, think about it. The person before you is now sitting down. So imagine that depolarization is when you stand up, repolarization is when you sit back down. Then put together the fact that the stadium wave is propagated. So if you have a whole bunch of people that are sitting down and somebody starts the wave, when I stand up, that means that you are then going to stand up, and then that's going to be propagating the signal down the axon. So let's go ahead and practice this when we look at this little chart. Now what's really handy is if you can look at this chart and understand why we can label it the way we can. For instance, if I go back, let me choose my pen. So if I go back, if I look at the blue, now again, yours is not color-coded. Go ahead and color-code it if you'd like. So here's our blue, and this is, notice, a picture showing an ion going inside the channel. Well, this is going to be sodium. Sodium's going inside. That means the sodium channels are open. And then the inside, as they flow in, the inside becomes more positive. Notice potassium is closed. So the blue line is depolarization. The green line, let's take a look at that. Here's where they're shut. See the little part of the protein that covers now. So this is the sodium. The sodium channel is now closed. And that happens right here at that point. Suddenly they slam shut. But notice, here's our little potassium that's now diffusing outside. So the green is repolarization as they diffuse outward. And notice the direction of the graph. In repolarization, it's going back to negative. Well, if you have positive ions that are leaving, that means the negatively charged ions are taking over in terms of the accounting. So now it's dipping back into the negative. Whereas in the depolarization, it's going up because we're getting more positively charged ions coming in. And this represents the inside of the axon. So in fact, I can give you an idea. When researchers study this, here would be the axon. They would stick a little electrode inside that and that's what it's detecting. It's in detecting all of the positive charges coming in and then all of the charges going out during repolarization. Now, the purple is a point in time called hyperpolarization. That's not as significant right now to worry about. It's a period of time where the potassium ions are leaving, the channels haven't shut yet, so it dips a little bit into the negative past 70. Well, the red line would be a neuron at rest, where all of the voltage-gated channels are closed, and we're not getting anything coming in and out due to them. Now, you still have those leak channels, but we're at rest. We're at a good negative 70. And then the light blue, well, what is the light blue then? Well, this is that positive feedback. This is when the stimulus occurs. And so you're starting to get a signal being generated. And if it continues and continues and continues until it hits this point, then we will have an action potential. This point right here is called threshold. If you hit threshold, you're going to have an action potential, and all action potentials are the same size, and so we call it an all or none. Either you're going to get an action potential of that size going up to that positive 30, or nothing at all. So if it's, and usually threshold, a good number to know is negative 55. That's a threshold. And if it hits that threshold, boom, it goes. If it's negative 57, 56, it's not going to go. It's not going to hit that action potential. So that's going over the charge. So that's going over what's happening inside of the axon. What we want to talk about next would be how it's propagated, what's going on, and then how do we make it faster, and then what happens at the synapse. But that's a good place to end for this video. Have a lovely weekend.